Good afternoon. I want to welcome you to this course on topics in church history. And we're going to be looking primarily in this course at Anglicanism, which is the Church of England, and how it developed from the medieval period. The first actual, from our outline, we're going to be looking at culture and life during the medieval time. And then we're going to go into the medieval church to give some background on how the Anglican Church developed. We're going to look at King Henry the Eighth and the Tudor dynasty. We're going to look at Anglican theology, basic Anglican theology and doctrine. We will look at social and cultural impact from the Anglican Church as it would develop a prayer book. It would break away from the Roman Catholic Church, and then it would essentially take Christianity around the world wherever the British colonized. We'll look at key Anglican figures and theologians, some that you already know, like C.S. Lewis, J.I. Packer, John Stott, William Wilberforce, who God used to overturn slavery in the British Empire. We'll go from there and we'll look at Reformation churches on the continent of Europe. We'll look at Lutheranism, Presbyterianism, the Reformed faith, the Methodist Church, the Church of Scotland, the Protestant Episcopal Church USA, the continuing Anglican churches, and then other bodies and groups. We will also look at the prayer book. We'll spend some time looking at the 11 different versions of the Book of Common Prayer, originally written. Really all of them are written by Thomas Cranmer, but then there were slight modifications for each one. We will look at the different branches within Anglicanism, from Low Church to Broad Church to Anglo-Catholicism. We will look at Richard Hooker, who was a theologian in the Anglican Church, as well as the rational movement, the Enlightenment's effect upon the Anglican Church, the evangelical revivals with the Wesley Brothers, the Holy Club at Oxford. We'll look at how that impacted not only England but America. And then we will move toward looking directly at the denominations that would emerge from the Anglican Church. Some of them you may not know about, like the Baptist Church, the Congregational, and in some ways the Presbyterians as well. So in this lecture, we're going to look at culture in the medieval period. Skeptics often refer to this as the Dark Ages. It was a 1,000-year period from 500 AD to 1500 AD. So why would they call this, especially atheistic, skeptical scholars? Well, first of all, the church was in power. Atheists, skeptics, as we find today in universities and in many of our organizations, were not in power. So they look at the medieval period, what we would call the medieval period, they look at it as the Dark Ages. Well, we could say today, with the secularists in power, that these are the Dark Ages. So it just depends on who's writing the history. So there were things going on in the Middle Ages that were difficult. There was the bubonic plague. There were the Crusades. There were wars. The church was largely in control and in power. Again, atheists, non-believers were considered heretics, and they were essentially not permitted. So you can see why they have sour grapes when they look at the Middle Ages. Many caricatures are presented of the Middle Ages: Monty Python, the plague. The Middle Ages were not a time that they were not times that were lacking, though, in art, in literature, in medicine, in hygiene, in money. There were also superstitions, but all of these, in many ways, are perceptions, especially the superstitions. There was some superstition during that time, but it was a time of great flourishing. The church, as we're going to see, developed education. Universities like University of Paris, Oxford University, Cambridge, many of the great schools that we know today as far as academia were developed during the Middle Ages by the Roman Church. So there was a great deal of learning, there was a great deal of culture, art, literature, as I said, medicine, all types of things. It was an agrarian culture, by and large. That meant that they were farming and living and producing things from the land was common. The church state held much more visible authority than today. The church and the state essentially were one. So in the Middle Ages, if you were considered a heretic, if you denied the virgin birth of Christ or the Trinity, these types of things, these could be punishable by death. Okay, so again, you can see why atheists, non-believers would not like this period of time. Some call our view of the past chronological snobbery. And I'm talking about modern people that look back at the Middle Ages and say, well, they didn't have computers, they didn't have TikTok, they didn't have YouTube. What did they possibly do with their time? Well, let's just have a little wake-up call. They were probably much more educated than we are today. Just look at Shakespeare. That would be like reading Mad Magazine in the 80s. Some of us can barely read Shakespeare. That was, again, like a comic book to them. So they were much better educated because they had much more time to spend. I mean, even though they had difficult lives and it was hard to make a living, they had a lot of time, especially the scholars and the clergy and others, to read and to study and to write great volumes of work, because they didn't have all the modern day technological distractions that we have. So for us to say they were living in the Dark Ages is what scholars call chronological snobbery. It's trying to place your culture, your values, your likes and dislikes, and put them on top of another generation in which you did not live. If people were living, could fast forward from the Middle Ages to our day, and they saw whole families walking down the street, each one holding a device, scrolling through it and not even paying attention to what they're doing, they might think we're zombies from another planet. You see my point? That's called chronological snobbery, trying to overlay your culture onto another culture. Now, that doesn't have anything to do with the Christian message. We're just talking about cultural differences, cultural adaptation, the way cultures develop, they change, they ebb and flow, and we're not talking about moral issues here. So that there again, chronological snobbery, trying to compare your culture to another. Okay, during the medieval time period, there was a lot of literature, Canterbury Tales, King Arthur, Robin Hood, Dante. There was a lot of theology being written, St. Augustine. There was scholasticism in the universities. There was St. Thomas Aquinas and his impactful work. There were cathedrals, some of which took over 100 years to build. They were into permanence. There was beautiful stained glass. You can go back and look at the Gothic architecture. There were monasteries. There were knights. There was warfare. There was jousting. There was body armor. There were the Crusades. There was the rise of Islam. And we find that many of the countries in the Middle East were already Christianized, and then Islam rose up and started warfare against Christians. And so many of the brothers and sisters in Europe said, we need to go and defend our brothers and sisters against Islam. So, the Crusades, sometimes the Christian church gets a black eye for the Crusades. We must remember the Islamic invaders of Christian lands, what were they going to do? Just sit back and be destroyed? So there were Christians that went over to help their Christian brothers, assist them. It would be like today's Western nations fighting against Hamas. And unfortunately, we have many propagandists in our own country that try to make Hamas look innocent and Israel look guilty. So this was going on. This is an age-old problem, and it was going on then. So there was great medieval art. There were castles. And just some fun facts about the Middle Ages. Animals could be put on trial during the Middle Ages. So if your dog bit someone, the dog could be put on trial. There were arranged marriages, especially among royals. The piggy bank was developed. People put their spare change and savings in a pot made of clay, and that's where we get the modern day piggy bank. There was mandatory archery training, probably out of self-defense. There were scams to be avoided, just like we have scams today, technological scams. You get a scam on your phone, someone saying they're the post office, or that you owe some toll that you never paid, and or they pretend to be Amazon, or they pretend to be the police saying you owe a fine. On and on and go. We have these scams today. Well, they had scams to avoid too. A sack of wheat could be filled with 75% rotten grain, and 25% of surface grain was fresh. So they had to avoid scams as well, because people, there were people that were evil in their day as well. Okay, there were tolls. Entrance was free in a city if you lived there, but tolls were charged for visitors, especially merchants doing business there. When we lived in Europe, we served in 2 different international congregations, one in Germany, one in France. When we went to Switzerland for a conference at 4 different times, 4 different years, for a week in the summer, each time, they actually, whatever inn you stay in or guest house, they have to charge a daily tax for you to be there. So maybe it's like 4 Swiss francs per person. If there are 2 adults and 2 youth or children, you might have to pay 16 Swiss francs a day, or it was something. It may have been less than that, but it was like a toll for visiting their country. Eels were sometimes used for currency. Someone is reported to have paid rent for land with 26,275 eels. From the 1330s onward, long-toed shoes were the rave. Okay, so if you see in these go look up some paintings from the Middle Ages, and you'll see these long pointy shoes, and some will curl up. The longer the point was on the shoe, it was a status symbol. So the longer the point was on your shoe, it was like a status symbol, that it meant you had more money than someone who had pointy shoes that were shorter. Again, these are fun facts from the Middle Ages. Football was banned in London, probably not our kind of football, but kicking a ball. It was banned in London April 1314. King Edward II banned it because of the loud crowds and fear of many evils that could arise from drunken football fans. You could be imprisoned for it. So we find that this is continued on among Brits. They go to soccer games, they get drunk, they get rowdy. And so King Edward II actually banned football in 1314. London, the population of London soared 500%. The population of London soared 500% from the 12th to the 14th centuries. Okay, so there was great growth in London in between the 12th and the 14th centuries. Trades were usually passed on to the next generation. So if you were a priest or a parson, that was passed on. If you were, a blacksmith, you were an esquire, an attorney, you were a doctor, whatever your father did, more than likely you would follow in his footsteps in the family trade. The largest towns in England were cathedral cities: Lincoln, Canterbury, York, Chichester. Merchants, many were wealthy and well-traveled. And there were some key events. We're not going to cover them here just in the interest of time. We're just sort of laying the groundwork for the culture and the climate that Anglicanism would arise from by the grace of God. But some key events during the medieval period from 500 AD to 1500 AD, some of the key events were the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the rise and spread of Islam, the Treaty of Verdun, the East-West Schism in the Roman Catholic Church. This is when the Christians in the East would break away from the Roman Church in 1054 and form a new body of Christians. Okay, so the Eastern branch of the church, known now as Eastern Orthodoxy, would break away from the Roman Catholic Church in 1054. So up to that point, there was only one church. There was the Catholic, the Universal Church, right, spanning back to the time of Christ and the apostles, all the way forward. That would be the Universal Church, the church from the very beginning that covers all periods of history. So when you pray the Apostles' Creed and you pray in support of the Holy Catholic or Universal Church, you're praying for all Christians in all times. You're in agreement with them that Jesus is your Lord, that there's the Trinity, heaven and hell, that the Lord will return, all of these things. Okay, so there was only one church until 1054, and then with the split, then there were two churches until the 1500s when Martin Luther started the Lutheran Church. So then there would be other denominations that would come. The Reformed Church in France that we're going to look at later in this course, not in this lecture, but in this course. There would be a number of other denominations that would break off actually from the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church. You would have the Baptists, the Congregationalists, the Presbyterians, and others that would also break away from Anglicanism and come to the States. So again, up to the 1500s, there would just have been two churches, the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church in the East, and then the Lutheran Church, followed by Reformed Church and others. This would all develop over time. Then there would be the Crusades. There'd be the Magna Carta. There'd be the 100 Years' War. And these aren't necessarily in order. There would be the Black Death, the bubonic plague, which would kill a great part of Europe. And there would be the fall of Constantinople and the exploration and discovery of the New World by Columbus. Okay, just a few more fun facts in this time. Up until the 16th century, forks were unknown in Europe. Can't read my own writing here. Okay, so up to the 16th century, forks, right? A fork that you would eat with was unknown in England. People either used spoons or their fingers. And one of my friends at church, he said, this may sound odd, but I really don't like using forks. He said, I prefer a bowl and a spoon. He said, it's just easier to eat that way, especially if it's like, chili or, whatever it is. He just prefers a spoon and a bowl. Well, he would have fit, he would have fit right in England before the 16th century. There were no forks. People just used spoons or their fingers. Notice this, salt was very expensive in the Middle Ages, as well as pepper and sugar. It was even more expensive by weight than gold. It's hard to get your mind around that. Musicians were a low class. After they played, most of them had to sleep in barns and stables. In the 1500s, King Henry VIII began the Secret Service, sending spies to the great courts of Europe. After a great battle, the women had to count the dead. Okay, this is an interesting fact. Again, this is trivial. But after a great battle, the women had to count the dead, and a handbag was used to put the hands of the dead soldiers for counting purposes. So that's where the term handbag came from. I know that's disturbing, but that's a little factoid from the medieval period. Books were rare and very expensive, and they were copied by hand. Monks often copied books by candlelight. One monk, if he made a mistake, in fact, one monk did make a mistake, and I'm sure they made many mistakes, but they had to go back and fix them. But he made a mistake when he was writing the Ten Commandments. He wrote, "Thou shalt kill," and of course that had to be corrected. The term Middle Ages was developed by scholars in the 15th century simply to define their own time from the ancient world. So they knew the ancient world would be the first part of history, and they knew that after their period would come, more modern times. So they stated that this period of time is the Middle Ages. Again, skeptics call it the Dark Ages due to the perception and a lack of scientific cultural advancements. But there were many scientific and cultural advancements, I've already stated before. Blaise Pascal was a Christian. He was a French mathematician. He lived from 1623 to 1662. There was Nicholas Copernicus, astronomer, lived from 1473 to 1543. There was the great Italian artist, Michelangelo, who lived from 1475 to 1564, one of the greatest artists, sculptors, painters of all time. He painted the Sistine Chapel, the Creation. There was Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1519, Italian painter, sculptor, architect, engineer, scientist, inventor, painter of the Mona Lisa, and many other great works. So there were incredible advancements during the Middle Ages. So I would completely beg to differ with anyone who would call the Middle Ages the Dark Ages. We have not produced anywhere near the cultural, artifacts and the art and some of the scientific developments that they did during the Middle Ages. And I know the Lord has enabled macrobiology and a number of other developments, but we cannot discount at all what God was doing during the Middle Ages. So again, there's going to be a major shift. There's going to be two churches. There's going to be the Roman Church, and then there's going to be the Eastern Orthodox, and later in the 1500s there's going to be the Protestant faith. Protestant simply means protesters. They were protesting against the theological and doctrinal and ethical errors that they found within the Roman Church. The medieval period was marked by what's called feudalism, a hierarchical social and political system made up of lords, also called vassals. They were landowners. A vassal was a landowner, but in the service of a lord. Many of the people were peasants, and they worked the land of a lord in this feudal system. Owning land gave you great social status. And so the Roman Church owned nearly 3/4 of the land of Europe, something like that. Actually, 1/3, sorry. But I think there's probably more land that they acquired. But they owned anywhere from 1/3 to potentially 1/2 of all the land in Europe. And think of all the buildings that they owned, all of the monasteries that they owned. So when King Henry VIII is going to assume power, because he wants to fight wars like most kings do, because it gains economic stability for a nation, even though it disturbs the young men, and war is an awful thing. But there would be, essentially to fund his wars, King Henry would sell off many of the monasteries. So they were in the medieval period. Again, the Roman Church owned around 1/3 of the land, perhaps even 1/2 of the land of Western Europe. No one really knows the exact amount of land, but it was a great deal. Many nobles and wealthy families donated land to the church. Again, there were monasteries where they farmed. They had monastical duties. They prayed at least 5 times a day, even in the middle of the night. Church land was tax-free. The Black Death killed 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351. There was a breakdown of the feudal governance, led to the growth of city-states in Italy, and a number of monarchs in Spain, France, and England this all marked the end of the Middle Ages. Okay, so there was a breakdown of that feudal system. And the feudal system, of course, would have had its strengths. It would have had its weaknesses as well. And we also find when the United States was colonized, there weren't towns and cities like we have now. What happened, there were, it was similar to Europe, sort of a feudal system. There were wealthy landowners who owned plantations, and they employed servants. And so most people, were indentured servants. One of my relatives named Gilles came over from, and I think they originated in France as French Huguenots. They were run out of France by the Catholic Church and the Saint Bartholomew's massacre, and so Gilles made it to Wales and became an indentured servant. His name was Gilles Vermilion, and he came to the United States as an indentured servant of this wealthy, either English or Welsh background individual, and he settled in Maryland. So this was very common that you were either, there was a smaller middle class during the Middle Ages, and you were either very wealthy or you were somewhat poor. There was not much of a middle class like we have today. So again, there weren't the cities and towns. There were these plantations where people worked, and to sort of bring people together, they slowly started to develop in the United States and in the 13 colonies, towns, and then medium-sized cities, and then the bigger cities developed later. So we also found that during the Middle Ages, education exploded with Charlemagne, who lived from 742 to 814. He was the king of the Franks. He was the king of the Lombards. He was the emperor of the Romans from 800 to 814. He set the stage for the great universities by expanding the palace school at Aachen. He encouraged monastic and cathedral schools in monasteries. He promoted literacy, and he promoted learning. And so Charlemagne would set the stage for many of the great universities, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, just to name a few. There were other advancements during this time period. Medieval social structure went from the feudal system. The nobility, the lords, the knights held the land, the power, the control, and the clergy in the Roman Church. There were the popes, the bishops, the priests. They held significant roles in society, both spiritual and political. So, the clergy in the medieval period, particularly in England, were highly educated. There were less educated clergy in other parts of Europe, but the clergy in England were highly educated. And part of the breakdown of the Catholic Church would include not only uneducated clergy in some parts of Europe, but moral laxity among the clergy, slothfulness, laziness. Really, you're not really seeing the outgrowth of a personal relationship with God. It seems to be more of a profession. There was something called simony during the Middle Ages. It was the purchasing of church offices. So if you were someone who was already wealthy and you were a secular ruler, and you could see that you could gain even more wealth and power by becoming an archbishop, then you would purchase an archbishop position from the Pope. So there was an example in Germany, and I may get the story wrong, but there was a politician who wanted to purchase an archbishopry position, and he made this deal with the Pope, and he said, well, how about 7,000 ducats, that was their currency, for the 7 deadly sins. And then the Pope may have said, well, how about 12,000 ducats for the 12 apostles? And then they agreed on 10,000 ducats for the 10 commandments. You see my point? So there was this bartering going on by secular politicians at times trying to purchase church offices. And then this particular individual who purchased this archbishopry, I believe it was in where Germany is now, would use the sale of indulgences to get back his 10,000 ducats. Does that make sense? So, they're not pursuing, some of these people didn't pursue the Lord or the ministry or the advancement and cause of Christ and the building up of the kingdom of God. Some of them were just pursuing it for their own personal gain. So this was by no means, every clergyman or bishop or archbishop within the church. But it was present. So we can't take our brush out and just negatively brushstroke everything dark and bad about the church at that time. That's simply not true. But there was certainly abuse within the church and among the clergy. Okay, a little more, we'll wrap up. Daily life, back to some trivial facts. I'll try to give you some history and then some trivial facts. Some history and some trivial facts. Bathing was not frequent during the Middle Ages. I wouldn't have done well there. I'd like to have a good shower every day. So they used perfumes and they used wigs. If you ever wonder why the men and women are wearing wigs at times, this is part of the reason. Bathing was not frequent. Sanitation was poor. Waste was often dumped in the streets. If you've ever traveled to Europe or France, you'll see in the little villages, you'll see these little gullies on both sides, and people would just dump their waste and it would just run right down the street. So hygiene was not, it wasn't, a top priority. They didn't really understand it, and it led to a number of illnesses until they figured that out. Towns had markets. Entertainment included music, dancing, storytelling, archery, jousting, football. There were arranged marriages, as I said before. Women raised families in the home. Children contributed oftentimes to the family life and to the family income at age 12. Hygiene was poor, which led to illnesses, as I mentioned. Homes were more like cottages. They were simple, 1 or 2 rooms, a thatched roof. Children often died in infancy. There was infant mortality, 50% death rate beyond their first year. Nobles and monarchs enjoyed a much grander menu, including meat, imported goods. As we're going to see in the life of King Henry VIII, he had a sumptuous diet and lifestyle, which ultimately led to gout and a number of other problems. He was also into jousting, and unfortunately, jousting did him in because they were trying to relive the conquests of battle, sort of like the Romans of the Roman Colosseum trying to relive the glory days of Rome. And in a jousting exercise, he was injured and he never fully recovered from it. So nobles, monarchs enjoyed a grand menu and really a very, rich lifestyle, essentially. Life could be harsh for peasants, for common people. Food was not always plentiful. There were limited comforts. So for your average person in the Middle Ages, right, you're going to live a simple lifestyle. You're not going to, you don't really have the option of middle class or upper middle class. You're either a peasant or you're among the gentry class. Peasants often ate bread, vegetables. Occasionally they ate meat, but that was not common. For women to be educated, they had to join a convent, and many female intellectuals became nuns because they could give themselves to the Lord, to study, to prayer. Salt, again, was referred to as white gold. Books took 2 weeks to produce, just 1 piece of parchment, untanned animal skin. So books took 2 weeks to produce. So again, this is probably someone writing, I don't say 24 hours a day, but they spent a great deal of time doing that. So inflated pig bladders were used as footballs. Sewing needles were owned by the richest women. There were odd punishments. There were torture museums in Europe. There were the stocks. There were animal masks. There were the stretching racks. So many sheep died during the Black Death in Europe that there was a wool shortage. And then again, as I said about the pointy shoes, they were a symbol of status, and they actually originated in Krakow, Poland, and they made their way to other parts of Europe. So I'm going to end there on the pointy shoes, a piece of trivia. But, life in the Middle Ages, we could say it was the best of times. We could say it was the worst of times. And I think in every generation, people could say that. These are the best of times. These are the worst of times. We either look at the glass as it's half empty or if it's half full. So there were many things about the Middle Ages we could say the glass was half full. There were other things we could say the glass was half empty. Infant mortality, the Black Death, the wars, a lot of division going on. But through it all, God was sovereign, and he used the Middle Ages to bring us to the place that we are going to go next. So in the next lecture, we're going to move more into England. We're going to look at King Henry VIII and the Tudor dynasty and how that all developed, and how the church God would use all of the events that were taking place in the Middle Ages with King Henry to develop the English church, the Anglican church. So we will pick up with that next time. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to being with you in our next lecture. God bless you.